Hi everyone, and welcome again to the Paradigm Shifters Book Club. Now this is part 2 of Inflamed, Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice by Rupa Maria and Raj Patel. And now, in part 1, we looked at the main ideas in the book and their extraordinary implications for all of our lives. And we discovered that the diseases that we should really worry about most are the chronic inflammatory ones, less so the infectious diseases. And why? That's because they are environmentally caused. Chronic inflammatory disease is environmentally caused and therefore preventable. But so far we're doing very little to prevent this class of disease. And we could and should be going much further in preventing some of our worst diseases. Now in this part 2, we'll look at some of the more concrete revelations in Inflamed in order to make it come alive in a more personally relevant way for you. And we'll take a deeper look at what chronic inflammation really means, how it drives the worst of our diseases, and what it has to do with the bacterial colonies in our gut. And then lastly, we'll examine the main environmental causes of chronic inflammation so we can be better prepared to protect ourselves from the devastation of inflammatory disease. Now, first of all, what is inflammation? I ask that because, I don't know about you, but I used to think that inflammation was when something gets swollen and red, and it might get all hot, and it kind of hurts. Well, nope, it's much more than that. And most systemic inflammation builds up in our bodies without us even knowing about it. No symptoms. Well, at least not for a while. Now, inflammation is a normal and healthy response to a threat, like a virus, for example. And the goal of inflammation is repair and recovery. And that's when inflammation is healthy and desirable. That is called acute inflammation. It can happen at any age, but sometimes the inflammation response doesn't switch off, and the result is a chronic systemic inflammatory state. Now, chronic inflammation, as opposed to acute, happens when the inflammatory response gets dysregulated. It goes kind of rogue. Why? Because something in our physical or psychological environment is poisoning or stressing us overwhelmingly. And this disorganizes our immune response. Now, when inflammation goes chronic, it can create ongoing harm, and it compromises the immune system's ability to repair damage. Chronic inflammation does increase with age, but it can happen even in kids when there's something toxic in their environment. So, how exactly does chronic inflammation become a problem? Systemic inflammation can end up attacking healthy tissue, healthy organs, and that's how it potentially initiates a very wide range of chronic inflammatory diseases, some of which can be fatal. In fact, the process of chronic inflammation is at the base of almost every major disease in the modern world. Diseases related to systemic inflammation are in fact our biggest killer. That's why they are our biggest worry. And here are the main examples. You'll find them all very familiar. Cancer, heart disease, inflammatory bowel disease, asthma, and a number of other respiratory diseases, clinical obesity, diabetes, especially type 2, arthritis, autoimmune disorders like lupus or Hashimoto's, neurodegenerative diseases like MS, a whole host of chronic allergies. Now, I'm wondering, had you heard this before? That these diseases are all based on chronic inflammation. There are more, and you might find these particularly surprising. Alzheimer's. Yes, Alzheimer's is not a normal part of aging, nor is senile dementia. Depression. Yes, this is related to inflammation in the brain, which, as we'll find out later, has its origins in gut inflammation. What? That's crazy, right? That would mean that diet plays a critical role in depression. Well, don't worry, we'll talk more about that later as well. So, recapping, that whole spectrum of chronic disease is in one way or another based on systemic inflammation. And those aren't the communicable diseases. You can't catch them from other people. So where do these diseases come from? Our environment plays a key role in either causing these diseases or protecting us from them. And by the way, that's not only a physical environment, and here's a really important thing to get, our psychological environment. In other words, our stress levels and our relationships. That's an equally significant factor in chronic inflammation. Now, here's where this thing gets a little scary. The World Health Organization says that chronic inflammatory diseases are, in one way or another, responsible for the early deaths of 3 out of 5 people worldwide. Now, 3 out of 5 early deaths. That's pretty sobering, isn't it? That means that inflammatory disease causes a whole lot more deaths globally than infectious disease. You know, the contagious ones that we catch from each other through viruses and bacteria, etc. And so, in fact, even in infectious disease, the quality of our immune response to the pathogen has a lot to do with having a balanced inflammatory response. So, if we catch an infectious disease, a well-regulated inflammatory response makes a world of difference to how well we fight off the illness, how sick we get, or even if we survive the infection. Case in point, according to the authors of Inflamed, that applied to COVID, no less. They point out that in over 90% of COVID deaths, the sufferers had already been battling at least one or more inflammatory diseases. Systemic inflammation can make us a lot more vulnerable. So, putting together all of the deaths caused directly by inflammation, plus all of the deaths caused by a dysregulated inflammatory response to infectious disease, the modern epidemic of environmentally induced disease is devastating on a much larger scale than the most recent pandemic. Let's stop to think about this for a minute. Inflammatory disease is, to a large extent, environmentally induced. That means that even when they can't be yet cured, these diseases are not inevitable. They can be preventable, at least to a considerable degree. Our biggest killer is preventable. Let that sink in for a bit. And I have to pause to wonder why we don't see anything remotely like the full throttle, coordinated response that we saw worldwide during COVID. Since a lot of inflammatory disease can be prevented before it even starts, then why don't health authorities double down and generate an emergency response? Millions are dying, millions more are suffering. Avoidably. Why is it still business as usual on this giant epidemic of chronic inflammatory disease? We know a lot about the environmental causes, we know a lot about how to make them go away, and that's what I'll be sharing with you as we move on. But the gross inaction and failure of political will on something that could save tens of millions of lives and a colossal amount of pain, suffering and expense, we have to talk about that too. But I will come back to that later. First, let's find out a bit more about inflammation. Specifically, let's look at the fascinating role played by the gut. Why is the gut so important in this story? Well, the gut microbiome is the incredibly complex ecosystem of bacteria that live in the inner lining of our gut. And these bacterial colonies are the new heroes in immunology. They are the engine room of our immune systems. We simply can't do without them. Their health is our health. And what makes our gut microbiome perform at its best? Firstly, having a large diversity of species is crucial. Secondly, having the correct balance between those species is also crucial. And the authors put it in this way: an appropriately diverse and functional gut microbiome is our most sophisticated defense against inflammatory disease. Okay, so a diverse and balanced gut microbiome is the deal breaker. It is the heart and soul of immunity, and that's the critical thing to get. That's the central principle. When we lose the diversity in our gut bacteria, or when we get an imbalance, in other words, too much of this one and not enough of that one, this is called dysbiosis. And what happens next is that our gut becomes inflamed. And here's the next thing. If this inflamed gut does not resolve, if it becomes chronically inflamed, then it can begin to inflame other systems in the body as well. How does inflammation then potentially spread from the gut throughout the body? Well, that involves chemical messengers called cytokines. But that process is so well explained in this book, and I don't want to burden you with the detail of that right here. Let's just say when the ecological balance of our gut bacteria gets disrupted, we are at a higher risk of developing chronic inflammatory disease involving other organs, which, to remind you, include categories such as autoimmune, allergies, diabetes, cancers, cardiovascular, pulmonary or respiratory, depression, anxiety, or neurodegenerative diseases. And then, to make matters worse, if we are unlucky enough to be exposed to an infectious disease, our immune response will be disorderly. When we're chronically inflamed, instead of fighting the infection, the immune system sometimes ends up attacking our healthy tissue. It's mind-blowing to discover just how much of our health depends on the state of our gut microbiome. This really can't be exaggerated. To hurt the bacterial colonies in the gut is to hurt human health. So, wait a minute, what about our genes? Don't they determine disease and health? Okay, you've heard about the genome, and you've heard that our genes determine our personal risk of disease. But new information has helped us to see our genome in a whole new way. Genes do matter. They do point to the weak links in the chain, so to speak, but the chain does not have to break unless we're putting tremendous amounts of pressure on it. In other words, you can have a genetic predisposition to cancer or depression or heart disease, but if your environment has been healthy enough, you might never even find out that you had those genes. Much more important than the genes is the toxic stuff that we have been and continue to be exposed to. So the new focus of attention is called the exposome. Now, the authors of Inflamed say this. They say the sum of lifetime exposures to non-genetic drivers of health and illness from conception to death is called the exposome. Get it? So it's less about the genome, it's more about the exposome. But that's turning medicine on its head. And here is how revolutionary this new model is. The authors assert that generally the state of the gut microbiome is a better predictor of disease than the genome alone. the means of assessing disease seem to be up for a root and branch workover. For example, here's another direct quote from the authors. Inflammatory markers in the blood provide a more complete risk assessment for cardiovascular disease than those that measure cholesterol. And another example, they say that clinical obesity is now more properly understood as an inflammatory condition that's caused by complex factors in the expo zone. It's not a simple question of the individual's greed or weakness of the will, that kind of thing. Perhaps the world needs to stop blaming sufferers of obesity for their struggles with weight and diet. In their defense, the authors say this: diets are products of society. To demand that the people individually take responsibility for changing their diet is not only to consign many to failure, but also to ascribe the fault of all who fail exclusively to a deficit of will on their part. That sounds like a fair point to me. And to that point, a UK study found that healthy diet costs twice as much to buy. Now that's just one of the many examples that the authors cite when they argue that solutions need to be political. Yes, individual, but also at the societal level, at the level of policy and regulation. Let's not just lumber the responsibility onto single individuals. The takeaway is, if the genome is the problem, then gene medicine makes sense. But when the exposome is the problem, then we need policy. We need to change the environment, and we can't change the environment alone. We need to work collectively. And I think that's what the authors mean by deep medicine. Deep medicine is preventive, and it will save many millions of lives. Now, here's a new big deal about the exposome. The environment that either protects and nourishes or inflames us is both the physical environment and the psychological environment. This still comes as a surprise to most people, but if you're suffering from depression or chronic anxiety, to a significant degree, this is about inflammation of the brain. Talk about a revolution in psychology and psychiatry. This means that one of the first things that would help you is to look for your environmental triggers, and your diet may be the first place to start. In fact, the new field of nutritional psychiatry explicitly recognizes that without a healthy, non-inflammatory diet, mental health is badly compromised. Incredible, isn't it? In accordance with the new science, psychiatry does not begin on the couch. It must begin at the breakfast table. Imagine that, inviting your psychiatrist over for breakfast. Maybe not. Okay. Now, diet is now known to be an essential part of treatment protocols for depression and anxiety disorders, bipolar disorder, ADHD, schizophrenia, autism spectrum disorder, dementia, and many more. Psychiatrists and clinical nutritionists working in tandem are getting stunning results just by knocking out inflammatory foods, usually the processed foods and the junk from the diet, and restoring a healthy balance of gut bacteria. And now I want to tell you what's coming up next in part 3 of this series about this book, Inflamed, in our Paradigm Shifters Book Club. Okay, in part 3, coming up next, we'll take the basic concepts put forward in this book and move into what it means in a real sense for all of us. In other words, the practical, personal implications, as well as the long-term societal implications. And that means we're going to look at 8 types of environmental causes of chronic inflammation. Some of those are physical, material, and some of those causes are psychological, involving relationships and social structures. I'll tell you now that in talking about those environmental causes, sometimes I will stray from the content of this book, and I'll be drawing on my own research and experience as a psychologist, but I will make it clear each time I'm doing that. And looking at those 8 classes of environmental factors will have some clear implications. This is when we get to the nuts and bolts. It's going to point directly at practical changes that we can make in our lives that can make huge improvements in our health and resilience. But there's more. You'll see that these highly inflammatory environmental factors are entirely replaceable and avoidable, and by implication, this points clearly, directly, and inescapably to some functional changes to the way that we do things as a society. The political and economic implications are really, really clear. And the good thing is, you'll see that all of these changes at the policy level are perfectly achievable, and that these are initiatives that you can really give your voice to if you feel to do that. So I'm really excited about sharing part 3 with you coming up soon. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey so far. If you'd like to support me in doing more of this work, please hit the like button and subscribe. And consider sharing these videos with your friends. That's all free, but it makes a big difference at my end. Also, to find out more about my articles and videos about psychology for paradigm shift, please visit my Substack and consider subscribing. I look forward to seeing you at part 3, and until then, adios.